So remember, he's a Roman writer, again from the 1st century CE, and he gave us some interesting information, very kind of condescending words about these Essenes. We've been studying Essenes, but he told us that a very important part that he told us is where they're located. He gave us the place where they live. He described a little bit of their geography. So we actually have, from the 1st century, a witness, a testimony that says where these people lived. It doesn't matter that Pliny did not like them very much, you know, how he speaks about them in a slightly disparaging way. For us, as students of history, we're just looking for historically verifiable facts that we can find. So the west side of the Dead Sea is what interests us now. Look, this is the Dead Sea, essentially. So there's a road that goes right here between Jerusalem and right here is Jericho a little bit, and it would go to the edge of the sea right here, and it would split up going north up along Jordan River all the way to Galilee, and then there would be a road going south up along the sea all the way down. So if you've traveled this area, you know a little bit. There's a lot of hills right here between Jerusalem and the area we call Qumran. Very interesting area for us because of, it made it really famous because of all the scrolls they found in this area. But the scrolls, if you've heard about the Qumran scrolls, they were actually scattered in a multiplicity of different caves all throughout the region. A lot of times when you encounter a scroll, you would see it's coded with different, sort of say, reference points, and so you will hear, you will see like a reference, it's kind of like a biblical reference that goes after the writing, and it will tell you where the scroll is coming from. It's coming from Masada or it comes from En-Gedi. The Dead Sea Scrolls that we call them Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them are Qumran scrolls and some of them are not Qumran scrolls. Some of them come from other areas in that general region. So it will take you probably from Qumran to Masada, for example, it's probably a half an hour drive on a car, you know, about that. So this is a fairly wide area. But so we learn about these scenes being located on the west side of the seashore, essentially. And the Dead Sea, of course, is not a very hospitable environment. It's very hot. It's very dry in there. And that's where we sort of say stopped last time. We looked just a tiny bit about at this community of Essenes. And I shared with you that as people found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found all these jars, this library stored away in the caves. After they discovered the jars, they started looking nearby what's in the area, and they found remnants of a compound. I want you to see something on this picture, and this is an interesting sight. So right here you see a compound. It's a pretty decent sized area. You could see remnants of walls. Okay, this is from like 2nd century BCE and into 1st century of the Common Era. That's when these walls were actually standing and the area was occupied. But after that, it just became desolate. What I want you to see is right here is this ravine. Do you see this ravine that goes in? It's pretty deep. Okay, this is called Wadi. And what happens is in the wintertime, as the rains would come, believe it or not, this wadi would be filled with water, and it would go up almost all the way to the top sometimes. That's how much, as the water is rushing down the hills, it's gathering strength, and it's actually digging out these wadis that can be quite deep, and it could wash out the roads. And even today, if you travel in that region at that time of year, Yosef can tell you how many roads get washed out by the water coming off the hills. It's fairly inconvenient when the water comes up the hills and it just takes and it grows across the highway, you know. And what are you going to do? It's water.
They actually put in a warning about when the rain season starting, that in those areas there do not travel because of
you stop using these roads. Like these roads are off limits for this time of the year because they're going to get flooded.
It's something that unexpected. Suddenly it starts raining so badly that it's you suddenly in dry areas and have a mud river going through that and washing everything across that. So
yeah, very unusual geography. It's a very dry place. It's a desert, but all of a sudden, so much water comes through, and so you could see obviously you can't absorb. But what the settlers in Qumran would do to get themselves water is they would take this water and they would drain little channels off into their compound. They'll make little channels and trap it and make basically reservoirs for water for themselves. And they actually lived there and used water. So this settlement, the picture which I just showed you, it's known as the Qumran settlement, had everything that you would need to support a few hundred people, essentially. Judging by its size, a few hundred people can live in that area and work and go on with their lives. But one feature that always impressed the archaeologists, people that were always amazed by that right away, is a really sophisticated water system that this community had. They're in the middle of a desert. The water doesn't come all the time, but here's these cisterns of water they would have. And so the Essenes, this community in Qumran in particular, based on their writings, what we can tell is they were very much into immersing themselves in water twice daily. They took mikvah in the morning and in the evening. So there's all these immersion pools that are found in the middle of this settlement, in the middle of a dry desert. This is an actual immersion pool that has been slightly revamped, rebuilt. It would have had a roof. It wouldn't have been open like that. It would have had a roof. But in order for you to see it, they kind of left it like that. You could see the steps going down and up, so people would go in. So this is what's called the mikveh, and it's one of the many ritual pools that are found in Qumran. And it was used specifically for immersion rituals. No, it's not for washing dishes or getting your water for cooking or anything like that. It's for ritual purity. The water was brought into these pools through pipes. There would be clay pipes that would basically divert water from the reservoirs. And then, of course, the walls are covered with plaster. It's rocks, and then it's plaster. So it's just like an old house, if you think about it. It's the same technology of how people built houses, by using plastering the walls. And then the worshiper would come in, and they did this twice a day. They would descend down one side of steps and exit it on the opposite side. Because one side, you're going in, it's the impure side, but you're coming out, now you're pure. So it's kind of it's a two-way traffic, if you want to think about it like that. And so some of them are slightly smaller, some of them are larger, some of them are just basically big enough to get one person in. That's about all. And some of them are a little bit more elaborate. So there's a whole number of these mikvahs that you can see. So here's a smaller one, for example. You could see how the steps are done on one side, and then on the other side, a person would go up these steps. So going down and coming out, you take a different set of steps. And of course, like I said, it would be covered. There would be a roof part right here in the entry. So if you've been to Qumran, you will see these everywhere. And right here is a waterway. So there would be a waterway right there. And people would bring water through these channels, fill up their mikvahs, and they were being used every single day. It's a very, very interesting and unique feature of the community. Now, I'm going to say this. All over Israel, people found mikvaot. Specifically, these immersion pools are found in areas that you would not expect. For the longest time, people thought that people would take a mikvah, they would take this immersion ritual only in a place that they would come to worship. So for example, when they're excavating the part of the temple where the main entry gates were in the temple, there's like 100 or something, these little immersion pools everywhere. People would come in, immerse themselves, and then they would go and enter into the temple. That way they go in, sort of say, pure, because right before they go in to worship God, they would immerse themselves, come out, and go into the temple court. But finding them in places like that is something new.
Did they have a way to drain it somehow? Because you would think that over time, like natural body oils and even like, the idea of daily bathing, I mean, I know they're doing it for this purpose, but I don't know, you just, even like feet getting dirty, wouldn't there be a way to kind of, so many people coming in and out, in and out?
A bucket is the only thing you can do. What happens is, you could not clean this out. There's no drain. There's not a drainage, no, because the purpose of a mikveh is ritual immersion. The natural mikveh is a lake, a river, and an ocean, and you obviously don't drain them. Things just settle at the bottom, right? So you think about it, a body of water that's natural body of water is an acceptable mikveh. And so people today, when they need to do a purification ritual, if they do not have a specific pool like this, you can use any body of water that's natural, that's filled in with what we call earth water, rainwater, right? It's naturally occurring water that has to be used for that. And so, yes, there was no drains, but people go in not to become clean, people go in to become ritually pure. That's really what it's about. In fact, you're supposed to go into it clean already. You don't go in there to clean off dirt. It's completely different purpose, so to say. And that's, so they found all these mikvahs over by the temple, and they thought, okay, that makes sense. People, before they go into the temple, they would go through a cleansing ceremony. But what would you think if you found mikvahs in the middle of a Israelite countryside right next to a field? Like, do farmers need mikvahs or something like that? Yes, they do. Why? Because they worship there too. All of a sudden, archaeologists would find mikvahs, particularly that belong to that era, that belong to like 2nd century, 1st century BC, 1st century CE. They would find mikvahs all over Israel in the most unexpected places. Almost every synagogue would have a mikvah. They would have a community mikvah. But then some houses would have their own private ones. Okay, and they would find them in the agricultural areas, you know, and places like there's not even houses, there's just a field. Obviously, clearly, there's really nothing here, but there would be mikvahs there because that was a part of people's daily life. It was part of their belief. It wasn't necessarily tied to temple worship, it was tied to worship in general, to private life and sort of say, and personal individual devotion to God. So even if people lived great distances from the temple, they would find mikvahs there. And so people realized that for Jews in that era, that was an important way in how they showed devotion to God and expressed their spirituality. So you would find places like that all over Qumran. So for Essenes, the immersion water really was on showing God one's constant need for spiritual cleansing. That's what they were emphasizing through this ritual. At the same time as this happened, as people would go into a mikvah, it would remove any accidental defilement which the worshiper might come in contact with just through their mundane activities. You realize that becoming defiled or becoming unclean is a function of life. You just do things in life that you do, and inadvertently you come in contact with something that is unclean, and now you're defiled. So Essenes believed that worshiping should occur in purity, and that's why they did this daily, twice, just to make sure that they're not standing before God defiled. So that was kind of to ensure that they're in a right state before the Almighty. So that's, some people took it that seriously, and they certainly were a community that did. I'm not sure every community did it quite to that extent, but they were certainly into this idea of a mikvah. So the Essene community at Qumran was very, very pious as far as we can tell. They focused on these aspects of purity in daily life, and they were deeply spiritual in their observance. How do we know that? We know from the documents that came up from that era. So they looked deep into the Torah of Moses. They looked into the words of the prophets. That's what they studied. They meditated upon these words all the time. All of their documents reflect this deep state of attachment to these texts, understanding what they mean, digging into them, reflecting upon them. So, but they did not just pray and study scrolls all day. A lot of times people think that the Essenes community, all they did is they wanted to get away from the world. They just kind of wanted to live there, make their little monk enclave, and just pray and study all day long. That's not what they did. They actually worked really hard to provide for their needs. Their day began with immersion and prayer, but then they immediately went to work. And they worked hard all day, and they provided for themselves. And then they would take a break in the heat of the day. And they would eat together. But somebody had to prepare all that food. Somebody had to do all those things. So, of course, we know that not all Essenes lived in the middle of the desert. This is only one community, by the way. Some lived in villages all across the land of Israel. For a while, we thought that Essenes were only in that particular area, right? Because we have the testimony from Pliny telling us But no, there are other writers who tell us otherwise. They lived everywhere. There were Essenes areas throughout Israel. It was an ideological movement with some diversity, but they lived all across the land. So how do we know this? Well, we know it from places like Josephus and Philo. So here's a couple of quotes for you that I wanted to highlight. This is Josephus in Jewish War. He writes, "They have no one certain city, but many of them dwell in every city. And if any of their sect come from other places, in every city where they live, one appointed particularly to take care of strangers and to provide garments and other necessities for them." So this is Josephus telling us that the Essenes lived in cities. Now, if you remember a quote that I read for you earlier, said that they don't like cities. They prefer the countryside. So there were some who did not want to live in the cities because they believed the cities were full of corruption, where others were actually city dwellers. But they would have their own little part of the city that essentially would provide them the comfort of their own community. And they would welcome and entertain strangers. So as I opened the study, I talked to you about how Yeshua needed a place to stay in Jerusalem. And that is one place that you can go, because this community in particular welcomed strangers. They wanted people to come and be a part of their holy environment. They didn't see that that was a problem. They actually believed that that was a way for them to extend hospitality, kindness, to live out Torah, and at the same time to be able to influence other people coming into their community with their values and share those ideas with them. So yes, places to stay, what to eat. A lot of times these Essenes would have their outposts pretty much throughout Israel. So this is Philo writing in the book called Hypothetica. He says, "Our lawgiver trained an innumerable body of his pupils to partake of those things who are called Essenes." So an innumerable body, of course, maybe is an exaggeration. He tells us in another place how big the community was. So he says, "And they dwell in many cities of Judea and in many villages and in great and populous communities." So again, we have another witness from the first century that tells us that the Essenes are not just found in Qumran. They're not just on the shore of that sea. They are actually all throughout, scattered in various cities and villages all throughout Israel. So it's interesting witness from these historical sources. Now, to read a little bit more from Hypothetica, we've been reading some from Philo, some from Josephus, and we'll just keep doing that for this study because they probably write more than anybody else about Essenes, both of these first century writers. So Philo in Hypothetica continues, "No one among them ventures at all to acquire any property whatever of his own, neither house, nor slave, nor farm, nor flocks and herds. But they bring them together into the middle as the common stock, and enjoy one common general benefit from it all. But the different members of this body have different employments in which they occupy themselves, and labor without hesitation and without cessation." So once again, if we want to understand the life of the Essenes, we have limited sources, but Philo here seems to have an idea, seems to have an understanding who these people are, and he tells his audience that they live in the communal way. They share. They pool their resources. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Kind of like the book of Acts. So they pool their resources, they bring everything, and they put it all in the middle, and they say, "Here's my stuff. I'm sharing. Now it's it's ours. Now we get to use this. So I have this flock, but now it's a communal flock. Now all the milk that comes out of these goats, everybody gets to use it." And that's how they lived it. They didn't care about the land. They didn't care about acquiring large amounts of land. Why? Remember what I told you. They're not going to need it because the Great War is coming. The end of the world is coming. You're not going to need all this stuff. So can you just live a good life right now and dedicate yourself to God fully while pooling their resources allowed them for that?
So I guess I'm wondering, what did their power structure look like? Because or like their order of being,
We'll get to that.
you know, you're going to get to that. Okay.
Great question. I promise we'll get to that. They did have a very particular structure on how they conducted themselves. They had leadership. They had very clear structure. Remember we talked about Essenes being a movement that's tied to tzadok, tied to priests. They're a priestly group. They are very much focused around priests. So guess what? Their leaders are going to be priests from the line of tzadok. It's a hereditary position. So continue a little bit more. Reading Philo. Some of them who are devoted to the practice of agriculture, being skillful in such things as pertain to the sowing and cultivation of lands. Others are shepherds or cowherds and experienced in the management of every kind of animal. Some are cunning in what relates to swarms of bees. Others are artisans and handcraftsmen in order to guard against suffering from want of anything of which there is at times an actual need. I know it sounds like a very lofty language, right? That's because it's an English translation from 1800s. If that's what it sounds like, it's exactly what it is. Sometimes I try to smooth it out and take out archaic words, but that's essentially what Philo is writing. He's telling us they're involved in all sorts of labor. This is not a community that just prays all day long and copies scrolls. These are people of the land. They live, they cultivate, they keep bees, they keep animals, they take care of things. Why do they do all this? So that they can have a holy life, because they need to sustain that community. And they're not going to go out and ask for donations from all of the Israelites to somehow support them, because guess what? That support is already going towards the temple. But no, they need to be in their community sustaining themselves. So yes, they have needs and they provide for their needs. Rather than looking to outsiders to supply them, they create their own internal economy that basically works for the common good of themselves. They're not sitting still. They're very, industrious in what they do. It's just that their industry is not designed to create a massive agricultural corporation that would produce profits. It's not about profits, it's about sustaining the lifestyle. It's to be able to provide the needs of everyone, not necessarily have growth so that your shareholders can benefit, sort of say. It's a different type of an economic goal that they're pursuing. They just want to keep things going. So many scholars believe that the Qumran settlement, as we said, had priestly origins. Essenes is a group. We know they protested Jerusalem temple, the worship that happened there. They believed that it was corrupt beyond any hope, and those who were in charge of the sacrifices basically took it in a direction they could not follow. So they protested and withdrew. Actually, if you want to know what the crux of the matter was, the biggest disagreement they have was calendaric. They followed a calendar that was a combination of solar and lunar calendar, where at that time in their era, the temple switched over completely to 100% lunar calendar. And so that created disagreements about certain dates and certain times. And if you understand Judaism, time is sacred. Celebrating something on the right time is important. Being right on the time is important. It's not about an event that happened many years ago. It's about the event that happened many years ago today. That's what's important, is connecting to that across time. So they had big calendaric disputes and disagreements with people who were running the temple, which were Sadducees, whom we studied, okay? Also from a line of Tzadok, but a different ideology. So as we read their internal writings, they speak a lot about the temple. They speak a lot about priesthood. They talk about sacrifices. They talk about priestly functions. Clearly, Essenes really knew that context really well. And besides, their leaders were always chosen from the priestly background. Priesthood and ritual purity go hand in hand. You can understand. Why are they so bent on going into mikvah twice a day? Because if you see yourself as a priestly person, then staying pure before Hashem is important. What's really remarkable, and I find this, and when I first saw this in the Qumran scrolls, I was actually so surprised. Now, sort of say, it's been settled in my mind. Some of the Essenes even believed that Messiah would be a priest, meaning he would come from the line of Aaron. I always have to ask myself, how did they get there? Doesn't the Bible actually say it's going to be tribe of Judah? Yes, it does, but somehow they found some way to get them to the interpretation that Messiah is going to be a descendant of Aaron and not from the tribe of Judah. So he's going to be a Levite. Very, very interesting idea. Not that he's going to be just a priest or a priestly Messiah. So if you're familiar with the idea that in the book of Hebrews, Yeshua is called a priest, right? But not a priest of Levitical origin. So you could be a priest and a non-Levite. There is a system which allows you to do that, but not for the Essenes. For them, obviously, Levitical heritage was very important, and so they believed that Messiah is going to be one of the sons of Aaron.
Do you think that maybe they saw like connections, like that Messiah would be like a priest, and they're like, oh, well, if he's like a priest, he should be coming from the line of Aaron.
Exactly.
When it's really, oh, he's like a priest, but from a different priesthood.
It's a deduction, right? Yeah. So if you believe that Messiah is a priestly figure, then it would make sense that he would be from the right family. So it's an assumption, it's a deduction, and people go that way. And once it becomes a belief and becomes a tradition, then it becomes settled, and people don't like to question those things because somebody a long time ago said it must be true. So, I mean, I think some of that is still that way today, right? We still do that. That's just human nature. So that's just something about their leadership. You asked me that question. Here's another quote from Josephus that I want you to see a little bit more about their life, what they're like. He writes, as far as their piety towards God, it is very extraordinary. For before sunrising, they speak not a word about profane matters, but put up certain prayers which they have received from their forefathers. So, as the sun rises, they're off to prayer, and they don't speak. They don't have a conversation with anyone. They pray first. Their day begins between them and God. And they pray very specific prayers. So they have a liturgy. They have things that they say that they have received from their forefathers. So it's not just anything. There's something set there. This is after this, every one of them are sent away by their curators to exercise some of those arts wherein they are skilled, in which they labor with great diligence till the 5th hour. So pray, then you're being sent to work. In fact, you're being told where to go to work depending on what your skill set is. So you are being ordered to go and do what the community needs until the 5th hour. So what is the 5th hour? If you think about it, the sunrise being roughly around 6 o'clock in the morning, right? So go from 6 a.m. or 11. So yeah, we get to the noontime basically now. After which they assemble themselves together again into one place. And when they have clothed themselves in white veils, they then bathe their bodies in cold water. And after this purification is over, everyone meet together. So pray, work, purify, eat. Guess what they're going to do next? They're going to go back to work. You got it? This is how their day goes. This is a day in the life of an Essene, according to Josephus. Now, Josephus had a very interesting fascination with Essenes. From his autobiography, he wrote a book about himself called Vita, his life. He's one of the few writers that actually wrote about it. He said that he really flirted with the idea of becoming one of them. He was so, impressed by their spirituality. Josephus was born in a priestly family, so that kind of attracted him. He's actually quite prominent aristocratic family. But then Josephus, ideologically, was a Pharisee. And he really liked what the Essenes had to offer. The criticism of the Pharisees they had, apparently some of those criticisms he agreed with. So he really flirted with the idea of becoming one of them. That's why he likes them so much. He's just very fond of them. However, he admitted that the kind of a discipline that they required, he wasn't up to. So he ended up backing out. He never did become a Essene, according to his stories about himself. Yes.
So based on the description of this, when we were growing up in Romania, our families, I mean our parents, they worked from either 5 to 1, came home, and our lunch was what Americans have dinner.
Right.
And dinner was something very light.
Yes. That's exactly how it is.
Or 8 to 2, not like the 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 that
Yes.
they work in the United States.
Yes.
So it's kind of a similar.
Very similar type of routine. So in ancient times, I want you to know, people did not eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Actually, people, what they did is they would get up, they would have a very light snack. They would head out to work, and that would be with the first light, because you use the daytime hours. The heat of the day comes in the middle of the day, and that's why you take a break, and that's where you eat your big meal, and a lot of times take a nap. Okay? So Latin culture still does that. They call it siesta, right? So you take your nap in the middle of the day because you can't work because it's so hot. The sun is just too much to handle if you're working outdoors. So and so people still do that. That is still part of the agrarian lifestyle. So your first meal would be more of a snack. Your second meal would be a big meal, a substantial meal. And your third meal would also be a bit of more of a snack rather than a proper meal. And that came actually after dark already. So as the sun set and you can't work anymore. That's about it. So it's an interesting life that they live. So here's an excerpt for you from a document called Community Rule. This is 1QS. QS stands for Qumran Scroll. So this is a reference system that every time, like I said, Qumran scrolls have, Dead Sea Scrolls basically have a reference system, so a lot of times you could tell where it comes from. So, but this is one that's called Community Rule. It says, they shall eat, pray, and deliberate communally. Wherever 10 men belonging to the society of the Yachad are gathered, a priest must always be present. Did you notice something? So they pray together, 10 men have to be, and this document calls us what they call themselves, community of the Yachad. Yachad means together, unity, right? So that's what they call themselves. A priest must be present. So it takes a minyan, and there has to be a priest in order for things to happen, because he's their leader. This is, the man shall sit before the priest by rank, and in that manner their opinions will be sought on any matter. When the table has been set for eating, or the new wine readied for drinking, it is the priest who shall stretch out his hand first, blessing the first portion of the bread or the new wine. In any place where there's gathered a 10-man quorum, someone must always be engaged in a study of the law, day and night continually, each one taking his turn. This is an interesting value. So they sit down to eat, has to be a group of people, and if there's a group of 10, there has to be a priest, and a priest is the one who says the blessing over the food, thanking God. But they don't just eat. They study, they deliberate. It's interesting because you look at the rabbinic documents that we have today from the 2nd century Mishnah, and it says very clearly that when you sit down to eat, make sure your conversation is a holy conversation. Make sure that you discuss the words of Torah. In fact, one rabbi says, and I think this is Pirkei Avot, he says, if there are no words of Torah spoken at your table is like the altar of idolatry. I know it's a hyperbolic, but Jews do that. They kind of exaggerate, okay? If you don't speak the words of Torah at your table is like the table of an idolater. It's like an idol altar, essentially. What it's trying to say is that be the holy people you were called to be. If you sit down to eat and you're going to have a conversation, make sure that conversation honors God, because you're actually eating food which comes from Him. So take that moment to acknowledge and focus on this holiness of that moment by interacting with other human beings in that manner. Be the holy community. So that's what they did. They studied the Torah day and night, continually, each one. Just interesting witness there for us. So, what do you guys think? Is this an interesting conversation now? Yeah, go ahead.
That stuck out to me because Messiah spoke the words, and he says, any man who teaches, against the least of the commandments, what we call least in the kingdom. And there you said that they were gathered, or they were numbered by rank.
Yes.
And I know the Holy Bible teaches about, he will give us all positions based off of the works that we have done since coming to the knowledge of Messiah. We do a different work now. We do a work of the Spirit. And that's what I saw. I saw Messiah, and I saw those who were, in rank based off of what they did. So if there's a man last in the line, he was probably teaching, Sabbath is done away with. You don't have to keep Sabbath. Okay, you're saved, but you're least.
Right.
That's what I saw.
You're not far off. I mean, most of the time people were not teaching those kinds of things. So when you go to the saying that you're referring to is from the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, and it says the person who basically diminishes these commandments. What to diminish a commandment means to make it smaller, to make it less significant. So these commandments are important, right? A person says, "Oh, that's not that of an important commandment." That person is the least. It's a person who annuls. A person to annul or to diminish is to lessen the the importance of that commandment. So yes, there are some commandments that are more important than other commandments, and we should see them in a priority thing lineup, right? But we don't lessen even the smallest commandments. If you remember the teachings of Yeshua about commandments, he says that you tithe mint and cumin, right? But you've forgotten other weightier commandments. But he says you should do all these things. You shouldn't bring down a commandment about tithing mint and cumin. Yes, that's admirable. But don't forget the important ones, essentially. So yes, keep the important ones up front, but even the small commandments, such as would be tithing herbs, essentially, right? It seems like a tiny little thing, right? But to him, that's a sign of holiness. It's a sign of an intent. The person wants to tithe even the smallest amount of herbs that they have. That's admirable. Why? Because it shows their heart. It shows that they want to honor God even in the tiniest things they have. So there's a lot of teaching in the gospel that really extols the idea of following even the smallest commandments. And so the people who take those smaller commandments and diminish them, they will be the least. That's what he says. And so that's the idea. There is a ranking system, essentially. All throughout the Gospels, you see Yeshua teaching his disciples, and half the time his disciples are trying to vie for the positions of importance. How many times do they want to sit next to him, right next to him? Not 2 seats away, not 3 seats away, but right next to him. They want to be, and the person who sits next is basically the most important disciple. It's the next guy in line. He's the vice president of this club, right? That's how it works. So people would always want to be the sons of Zebedee. Can my son sit one to the right, one to the left? That request is a request for position, for prominence, for importance. Can they be the greatest? And so disciples would often discuss this question among themselves. Who's the greater one? Who's the most important disciple? Who's the first disciple? Who's the second disciple? And there is some hierarchy that we actually observe. A lot of times it's whom Yeshua takes with him as he goes places, right? That's how we know. He calls on certain disciples to accompany him, or he gives them certain tasks, or asks them to do a service for him because he deems them to be trustworthy and important. He relies upon them. And so who sits the closest to him, who sits the furthest, shows all those things. There's a hierarchy. And if you notice in these texts that we're reading, the hierarchy has to do with deciding any matters. So the first person that speaks is the leader, the priest. Then the people who speak as the first disciple would be given a chance to give an answer. The second disciple, and on and on and on. And they finally get down to the end of the table, to the person who just joined, 2 years ago. And they're still a novice because they've only been a part of their community for 2 years. So they need to earn their voice before they get to be one of the first people to speak. They could be educated, it doesn't matter. Their prominence is not as important because they're new. They haven't been tested by time, per se. So it shows to us a very interesting hierarchy, which we actually see in the Gospels in a very similar way. Anything else you guys notice that's interesting? This is their community. So we'll keep going through a number of these passages as we continue to study the Essenes, and I'll bring out all sorts of aspects of their daily life and worship and beliefs. As I told you, they had some really unusual sometimes beliefs, like believing that Messiah is going to be from Aaron. In fact, there's a couple of professors that I'm going to mention probably from Israel a little while later. They have some very, very interesting research they have done as far as what the Essenes believed. Anyway, so I'll throw some reading books for you later. All right, we'll wrap